Philip, for 2 millennia or more, dualism was the universal way of thinking of everyone, from common people to intellectuals, and certainly it has been a foundational doctrine of the Church, of the Catholic Church. You are a distinguished philosopher of mind, and among your colleagues of philosophers, the surveys have shown that a large majority reject dualism because of internal contradictions, interaction between physical and non-physical substances don't make sense. And a very small percentage of philosophers of mind agree with a dualist perspective. So how, as a philosopher of mind, do you deal with dualism, defending the Catholic Church's view and expressing your own?
It's not easy. So dualism is born in the Catholic Church because of the New Testament. So it's very obvious that Jesus talks about life after death. Jesus talks about himself being the Son of God, etc. And in St. Paul, it's very clear that the human being is made up of two things, a soul and a body, or what he calls the spiritual dimension, and then the material dimension, or the body, which he tends to speak negatively about. Therefore, it came into the doctrine of the Catholic Church as philosophical dualism, that there has to be a soul which survives the death of the body, and then, of course, the material component as well. Dualism, from a philosophical point of view, probably came into its own with Descartes. So we have what's called substance dualism. Descartes, who was a Catholic and taught by the Jesuits, and therefore was writing within the Catholic tradition, states that there are two things in the human person, rather than one substance as the person, the soul and the body. And that he probably did that in order to maintain the immortality of the soul, which he said was united to the body in the pineal gland, which is the base of the brain.
Middle of the brain.
So, and therefore, in modern and contemporary history of philosophy, we end up with what Chalmers calls substantial dualism, and two things, rather than what the tradition of the Church would call one substance with two principles. There are two non-physical principles that are present in the human person, one being the form, the other being matter. That's called hylomorphism, which I'd like to think is coming back into in fashion in terms of philosophical.
So explain a little bit about hylomorphism.
Hylomorphism is the theory that there are two co-principles that make up a being, act and potency. Act and potency is on the level of being, therefore what a thing is. And how a thing is called its nature, and its nature is composed by hylomorphism, a form and a matter. A thing that has a living nature, a thing that has a living nature. So you need both of these principles.
Now, are both a substance? We know the body is a substance for sure, but is the form a substance?
Well, Aristotle calls it a substantial form. So we want to avoid Cartesianism, which states that there are two substances.
Why do you want to avoid it?
Well, because then you no longer have the proper union of the human person.
Oh, because you have two separate things.
Correct. And this goes back to Aquinas's challenge to Plato. And because Plato talks about the pre-existence of the soul,
right.
And Aquinas says, if you postulate the pre-existence of the soul, you no longer have an adequate reason for the soul to be united to the body. And this is a difficulty that Plato has. And he has to talk about reminiscence. Plato has to come up with a reason, why would the soul ever be united to the body if it already knows, because it has access to the eternal forms, and if it's already in a pure state. And therefore, the body is seen as something that brings the soul down. Plato speaks about the soul being the captain, right, of the body. And Aquinas, I think, genuinely believes in the holiness of the person composed of body and soul. And I think also this is an argument to value the body. We are embodied, right? Embodied souls. And Aquinas even says the soul can survive without the body, but that's not its natural state. The natural state of the soul is to be united to a body.
Okay, so from a contemporary point of view, how would you address a fellow philosopher of mind to argue for dualism? Because obviously there are materialistic philosophies as the majority of thinking, certainly among scientists, but putting that aside, among philosophers who are non-believers. Even some philosophers who are believers, so I'm sure you know, would reject the soul. And they would, as believers, they would have a resurrection in the future where the body would be, and the person would be resurrected, but without a soul intervening in that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you would go about arguing that.
Let's start with arguing for dualism per se.
Okay, the argument arises when we look at reductionism. And that is probably coming from the neuroscientific community, where you have very intelligent people like Paul Churchland and others who...
Don't forget Pat Churchland, his wife.
And his wife, yes. Together they wrote a book, which was in the 1990s. It's called Neurophilosophy.
That was Pat. Pat did that.
Oh, it's still a very relevant book.
Absolutely.
That's almost 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So, they quote many of what I would call reductionist point of view, there is nothing more than the electric stimulation of the neurons and the axons,
and even more sophisticated ideas, whether it's quantum mechanics or electrical fields or all the different kinds of models, are all reductionist in some sense within that category. Now, some have expanded it, non-reductive physicalism. There are other ways of getting it, but the point is that to get to dualism, you need to show a problem with the materialism. That materialism cannot account, that mental states cannot be accounted by brain states.
Exactly. And I think that John Searle makes a good argument for that.
Even though he doesn't believe it.
Exactly, which is paradoxical. But in his book, Philosophy in the Real World, the subtitle, chapter 1 is dedicated to non-reductive dualism. But he doesn't, at the end, he says, but I don't believe that. But he does make the argument that in order to get, again, going back to consciousness, in order to get consciousness, you need brain states that generate that experience, what he calls the first person experience.
Right.
Now, even Chalmers talks about non-reductive dualism, and which is, I think, his point. It's very complex, but he does, in the first part of his paper on the hard problem of consciousness, he does state that reductionism is not an adequate theory of explaining what is going on. And I would use that argument myself. Then he talks about naturalistic dualism, which probably means Aquinas for him. He doesn't quote Aquinas, but that's the theory that he extrapolates. And then he goes on for the next 10 pages describing his non-reductive dualism, which is different than naturalistic dualism.
Right. And so from the Catholic point of view, how do those arguments for dualism stack up?
Yeah, you make a good point that there are some Catholic philosophers that don't buy into dualism, but I would, and you're correct, I would suggest there are no theologians, however, that do that.
I would agree with that.
Because how can you maintain the doctrine of the Catholic Church, which for a philosopher is not essential, in a sense, that's not the philosopher's job, but it is the job of the theologian.
Yeah, that's a good distinction.
Yeah, so, and I think that it is the most likely theory to ascribe in terms of understanding the human person.
Yeah, from a religious believer point of view of philosophers of mind who deal with the subject, Peter van Inwagen is one philosopher I greatly respect and a great friend of Closer to Truth. John Polkinghorne, who wasn't a philosopher but a quantum physicist who became an Anglican priest, dealt with this very much so. His view was somewhat similar, that there is some information pattern or something that can be preserved of the person so that at the resurrection, I think both Polkinghorne and Van Inwagen would subscribe to that. In the resurrection, God has the easy capacity to recreate that person with a new glorified body using the pattern, but that's not a soul in the interim period. There's no consciousness, etc.
Sounds like a soul to me. But you're right. As long as, I would suggest, as long as you have that principle. For example, some are saying it's information. Okay, so a person dies, but the information remains in some sort of quantum state, correct? That's just. Polkinghorne was also a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and he was very close to John Paul II. So that puts an interesting twist. And then you did adequately describe what happens at the resurrection of the body. At the end of all times, and this is on the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, you have the resurrection of the bodies, where the soul, which has existed without its body for a certain amount, outside of time, so it's difficult to calculate what we mean by that, recreates its body. As correct, God allows the soul to be united to matter. It's not the matter that you were born with or died with, because that's gone now, but it's a new matter, and therefore you have a new body.
Right, and the distinction, though, between what I believe Polkinghorne, Van Inwagen, and others subscribe to, and the tradition, is that in the interim period, there's no consciousness. There's no there's no existence. There is this pattern that exists that God knows in some sense, or stores in some sense, so that everybody has an individual, and that can be used in a resurrection. But there is no awareness in that pattern. I won't call that pattern a substance, because I don't think they would call it a substance. Whereas if you call it a substance, then it is something that can have an independent sense of consciousness in some sense, which I think is the tradition of the Church, of the Church.
It's just a little bit more complicated to explain it that way, I think. But you're essentially right. Like I said, if we hold to the principles, the explanation is different than the traditional one, but it's okay. What we're talking about is called interim eschatology. Interim eschatology is what happens to the human being or the soul between the moment of death and the end of time. Now, as the soul is no longer embodied, it no longer is inside of time, just like God is outside of time.
Yeah, that's controversial. Polkinghorne doesn't agree with that, but that's beside the point.
Okay, but
but it's a different sense for sure.
Yeah, to you, we don't really know. We can speculate, and so what is the explanatory power of what you just said, as opposed to perhaps something more traditional that you might find in the Catechism? Right.
And
but it is what you did say is fascinating. So I need to chew on that a little bit more.